Well, thank you, George, for inviting me. Gudrun, thank you for making everything work wherever you are. Thank you. And Jarmila, thank you for that nice introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here. It's a pleasure because this is a lovely city and I'm in a room full of smart people who share my interests. That's very nice. It's an honor because I get to be on the same program with Paul Heck and Alan Middleman, two scholars whose work I've admired for a long time. There's so much to say about this, and I'm going to say just the tiniest little bit, but I hope that we can unfold some of the implications of the things that I say and what other people will say today over meals or in the breaks between papers. So this is approximately 35 minutes. According to a recent digital count, there are 127 emotion words that appear close to 10,000 times in the Bible. A majority of those are in the New Testament. One scholar has counted 86 references to emotion in Luke and 89 in Acts. In Acts, that comes to about one emotion word for every 11 verses. In other words, there's a lot of emotion in the New Testament, but not as much as the Book of Mormon, where there is an emotion word every 6 verses. Nevertheless, none of us should bet on those numbers as a foundation for any argument about emotion in Christianity, because after all, what is an emotion and how do we recognize it? I will circle back to this vexing question of defining emotion, but it is worth bearing in mind that scholars writing in different times and places over many years have argued that the essence of Christianity is emotion. I do not mean essence in the Harnackian sense of a doctrinal essence or an essence of belief per se, but rather I point to something about the character of Christianity as a religion that relies primarily on emotion in organizing religious community, communicating religious ideas, and constructing moral frameworks for everyday life. When the sociologist of religion Christian Smith a few years ago grandly declared that Christianity works because it has met the emotional needs of those who are committed to it, he was building on a foundation that had been in place for a long time, not only in terms of the well-known theories of Friedrich Schleiermacher and Rudolf Otto, but to more recent writers such as Oscar Pfister, who argued that Christianity essentially was a religion of love dissolving fear, and Jürgen Moltmann, who characterized Christianity as a, quote, religion of joy. He should talk to Alan a little bit. Less flattering portrayals of Christian history, such as Jean Delamuse's study of the early modern Christianity, might emphasize Christian cultivation of fear and guilt as a Christian neurosis, an emotional problem. But the point has been well made that Christianity can be said to be emotional in many different ways, in many different styles. I want to begin then with a quick look at the New Testament as a point of departure for talking about emotions in Christianity. I have 9 points to make, there could have been several dozen, with regard to emotion in the New Testament. I will give a short example or two of each, and then move on to a broader history of conceptions of emotion in Christianity. So, in the New Testament, 1, emotions often are named. Joy, love, anger, sorrow, fear, and many other emotions are identified in ways that are familiar to us as 21st century readers, even if the text at times is not as crystalline as we would prefer. When Paul writes in Romans, I have great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, the emotional state is unmistakable. 2, emotion is implied in other texts. It is signaled by narrations of conversations, personal interiorities, and actions, including ritual enactments. When we read the shortest verse in the New Testament, Jesus wept, we do not need the Johannine account to supply an emotion word to tell us that affect is involved. A human performance is reported, and we infer from that, in its context, a feeling. Similarly, Paul's letter to Philemon regarding Onesimus sets the frame in several ways to communicate the fact that Philemon has a serious issue with Onesimus. As mob boss Tony Soprano might say, he has a beef with him. The implication of anger is obvious. As Francois Mirguet, whom Alan just mentioned, has shown, this kind of implication also is the case in instances in the Hebrew Bible. In fact, if I can just riff off that for a second, it might be the case that in Judaism, the conception of emotion has much more to do with the narration of emotion rather than a kind of analytical or systematic definition in a precise sense. 3, by the same token, emotion sometimes is not named when we would expect it to be. Again, Paul's letter to Philemon regarding Onesimus surely addresses Philemon's anger, but anger itself is not mentioned, perhaps for purely rhetorical reasons. Or we might consider a different example involving Paul. When Eutychus falls out of a third-story window in Acts and is picked up dead, Paul examines him, reports that he is not dead, and goes back upstairs to talk. There's no mention of how Paul felt. Or take another case. One scholar points out that although rancor, violent conflict, and persecution likely form the Zitzumleben of 1 Peter, and in spite of the fact that emotions are expressed throughout, anger is absent. Or we might consider the judgment of another scholar, that there is an absence of Jesus' emotions in the Lucan account of Gethsemane compared to the strikingly emotional Markan account. 4, there are mixed emotions. The Johannine pericope of the cleansing of the temple clearly describes a performance of anger, but the emotional state of Jesus is said to be zeal. Similarly, according to Matthew, the women at the tomb are afraid yet filled with joy. And Luke's mentioning of the life of a sparrow is a lesson of both fearing and hoping in God. 5, emotions can be hypocognized or hypercognized. In other words, some emotions are depicted as appraisals or judgments, while in some instances there is less such depiction. The Gethsemane story, a complicated, challenging case for emotions researchers, relates a story of lively cognitive exercise, of anticipation and appraisal of a future scenario of betrayal and suffering that causes sorrow in the present. On the other hand, the raw reaction of Jesus to the death of Lazarus, he wept and the onlookers said, "See how he loved him," suggests a hypocognized feeling, one that appears comparatively to involve less complicated cognitive machinery in its processing and expression. 6, characters in the various New Testament dramas have an awareness of their own emotions and of others' emotions. A good example is Mark's assessment of Pilate's motivations in handling the arrest of Jesus, which is depicted in straightforward language. He realized that it was out of envy that the chief priests had him handed over. 7, Jesus is portrayed as an emotional human who feels like other humans, even if, in some settings, there is a virtuosity to his emotional performance. 8, emotions can be good or they can be bad, and a specific emotion can be good or bad, depending on context. Jesus loving Lazarus presumably is an example of a good emotion, but the New Testament is filled with depictions of emotion as an affect of attachment to the wrong object, such as love of prestige, love of money or riches, love of sin, and love of self. 9, emotions that are least acceptable are those which are represented as passions, meaning that pathos, as Stoic philosophy held, was an excessive impulse, disobedient to reason, which moved the soul in an irrational direction. The passions were to be controlled. It is this last point that historically has served as the platform for much debate about emotion in Christianity. Simply put, there is a difference between head and heart. Is there a difference between head and heart? is the Cartesian divide between the res cogitans, the thinking portion of our minds, and the res extensa, the physical, mechanical, embodied provenance of appetites and passions, a foundational truth for Christian theologies about human feeling? Is cognition separated from emotion or conjoined with it? That debate has informed Christian writing about emotion since the most primitive Christian communities. There are debates among scholars regarding emotion, and especially the passions in the thinking of ancient philosophers. But in general, it is fair to say that the philosophical schools of the Greco-Roman world tended to a view of emotions as an infirmity. In general, they focused on addressing it as a pathology, and they proposed various therapies, including abandoning false beliefs from which passions grew, or as Seneca, the leading Stoic philosopher, proposed, a more thoroughgoing program of extirpating the passions, which were themselves an artifact of human activity within a diseased society. Plato, and more so Aristotle, had conceptualized emotions phenomenologically, that is, as embodied physical states, and took them to be a natural part of human experience. Plato remained skeptical about the usefulness of emotions, but there was some practicality to Aristotle's view regarding emotion. For Aristotle, emotion had its uses in the world. Contrastively, Stoics, who were enthralled by the inner world, did not see much usefulness in the passions. Less disposed to philosophically framing the construction of fair and just political institutions, they advocated apatheia, a life without passion, understood as freedom from the passions. Seneca, objecting to any compromise of that vaunted program, any averaging of passion into regulated behaviors, professed that the notion of moderation is false and of no utility. We should treat it just as we would the suggestion that a person ought to go insane in moderation or get sick in moderation. But later Middle Platonists, such as Plutarch and Philo, in fact rehabilitated and complicated Aristotle's notion of metriopatheia, a moderation of the passions, and imagined a soul that regulated the passions while still in the body. Philo, accordingly, commenting on Abraham's negotiation of the death of his wife Sarah, wrote, "And the advice of reason was this, neither showing agitation beyond measure, as in front of an utterly new and unprecedented misfortune, nor showing impassiveness, as if nothing terrible has happened, but choosing the mean rather than the extreme, he endeavored to moderate his passions." Much later, 3rd century Neoplatonists such as Plotinus and his student Porphyry took a harder line regarding the emotions. For them, emotions interfered with realization of divinity, which was possible only in the release from the body, including escape from embodied passions. Jewish Apocrypha was invested in reflection on the nature of the emotions, and like early Christian literature, it drew on the ancient philosophical schools in fashioning concepts of emotion and their place in moral and spiritual life. Philo, the 1st century Alexandrian, who attempted to harmonize Torah with philosophy, was widely read by Christian writers, some of whom wanted only to refute him, some of whom aimed to incorporate his arguments. In general, Christian thinking about emotion corresponded with Jewish ideas in some ways, and in other ways it did not. A Jewish notion of the feeling of repentance, understood as the migration from an old self to a new self, can be found in early Christianity. On the other hand, the Jewish emphasis on the embeddedness of feeling in the human experience of this world differed from the apocalyptic framing of feeling in Paul, and especially in view of his nagging suspicions about the flesh. In such early Christian literature, which foresaw a corrupt world soon coming to an end, there was a strong tendency to evaluate the emotions as a threat to moral life, adversely affecting human capability to reason to proper courses of behavior. And there is a sense that the emotional world of Christian insiders was different from those outside the community. Stoicism's influence on Paul is unmistakable, and there was a strong influence of the philosophical schools overall on early Christianity. As Paul and Jama, among others, have argued, many Christian theologians held the view that Christianity was actually the culmination of all philosophy. So it is no surprise that issues raised by the philosophers remain central to debate about emotion during the patristic, medieval, and early modern eras. In that long debate, what came to the forefront, among other things, was the issue of what kinds of rarefied feeling might be a matter of the soul, and correspondingly, what passions had to do with the flesh. For Clement, who was Origen's teacher in Alexandria, this is the 3rd century, so it's bleeding over into the third century, bleeding over a little bit more. Emotions were largely matters of the body, but at the same time somehow had some of the character of appraisals or judgments. That tension between embodied feeling, often decried as passions, and yet a certain measure of rational appraisal, schemed for centuries Christian theologizing about emotion, the soul, and morality. For Clement himself, as for the various Gnosticisms that grew from the soil of Origen's writing, the ideal, nevertheless, remained a state of apatheia. And Gregory of Nyssa, who, like other Cappadocians, was strongly influenced by Origen, God was rational and unembodied, pure, perfect, unified, and unchanging. Passions were not to be found in God, and those who would aspire to union with God were advised to be passionless as well. The pathway to that involved cultivating reason, following its dictates as a remedy for the pernicious influences of the passions. For Gregory, the body generated passions that threatened to run away with the soul that sought God. He wrote, "If reason lets go of the reins like a charioteer who has become entangled in his chariot," channeling Plato here, "and is dragged along by it, being pulled wherever the irrational impulse of the team carries him, then our faculties are turned towards emotions such as are seen among the irrational animals." But for Gregory, apatheia was a hallmark of divinity, and humans being humans, the default practical course, as Middle Platonists might argue, was to employ reason, to regulate emotions, editing and directing them into the right channels. In other words, in spite of theology that often was stridently worded, there was some slippage as far as a strict separation of embodied passion from the rationality of the soul. John Chrysostom, 4th century, also proposed that emotions could be moderated by reason, but Augustine, whose thinking about emotion, along with that of the other Latin fathers, became a standard view for centuries, advocated a more delimited Platonist approach. He insisted on a highly disciplined hygiene regarding emotional expression. For Augustine, emotion was at its best as a soul joined to God and shaped by that relationship in a way that inclined it to good. At the same time, keenly attentive to the likelihood of mixed feelings in people, aware of how destructive desires were enmeshed with holy affection, Augustine questioned the premise that persons can rely on feeling as a guide of any sort. In short, for him, emotion was legitimate in matters of the soul, but with his disparagement of the physical body, he could not countenance emotion, defined by him primarily as desires or appetites, because it turned the will from good. One historian accordingly has suggested that for Augustine, not a drop of affection was to be spilled on barren earthly terrain. Augustine accordingly was proud of the fact that he did not cry over the death of his mother, but he reported his tormented, heart-wrenching supplications before God. His influence, then, can be tracked throughout the history of Christianity, including through the Reformation. Martin Luther, once an Augustinian friar, had been shaped by the Augustinian view of passions as modifications of will, which might in some instances help direct a person to good ends, but more likely to earthly things, which for Augustine was a matter of concupiscentia or bad ends. For Augustine, dangerously unstable human affections nevertheless could be transformed potentially through the spiritual exercises of the devout and the inspiration of the Holy Spirit into their holy counterparts, constantiae. The eventually rebellious Luther leveraged that small opening into a window for further emplacing emotion in Christian piety. The Christian conceptualization of emotion developed new emphases during the effective turn of the Central Middle Ages. The widespread and vigorously pursued experience of identification with Christ's passion, which took place above all in communities of religious, and especially women religious, prompted a view of emotion as an experience that involved cognition and will in ways that Christian theologizing of previous centuries had discouraged, provoked by personal embrace of a performative script that was located securely in an orthodox frame of belief, in other words, in the gospel passion story. Persons learned to feel compassion for Christ in a process involving trust in embodied feeling as an authentic encounter with Christ, at the same time that cognitive elements, culturally mediated feeling rules for immersing oneself in Christ's suffering, remain powerfully in play in church ritual, directing the experience. Sarah McNamer, in her study of the medieval invention of Christian compassion, has demonstrated how the dynamics of that process, the implicit dialectical give and take between cognition and embodied feeling in the devotional lives of religious communities, initially gendered compassion feminine, although the eventual institutionalization of such devotions tended to masculinize it. In the midst of this background, and in the wake of the 13th century discovery of Aristotle's writings and their eventual translation into Latin, Aquinas reframed previous thinking about emotion that had been constructed out of Augustinian materials by drawing deeply on Aristotle's materialism. The central problem of the relation of body to soul, of bodily passions and spiritual affections, in Aquinas' hands became, for a time, less of a problem. His metaphysics steered away from Platonic dualism towards an Aristotelian hylomorphism in which soul and body collaborated as one substance, the former informing the latter. Such a view made possible a conceptualization of emotions as a matter of some degree of interplay between the holy affections and the passions. A skilled synthesizer of previous ideas about emotion, Aquinas argued that there was, as one scholar has characterized it, a logic of desire for Aquinas. Cognition, will, and body all were involved in the emotional life of a Christian. The importance of this philosophical achievement can be recognized, moreover, in ethics, in the Thomistic definition of the passions as component parts of the broad system of natural moral law. On another front, a distinct important development in Christian conceptualization of feeling likewise was taking place as part of the effective turn during the period in which Thomas was writing. During the Middle Ages, but especially in early modern Europe, Christian mysticism, as it was practiced in various ways, constructed an understanding of the holy life that took emotion as a crucial component of piety, at the same time that it sought escape from emotion as a bodily phenomenon, reporting the centrality of a feeling of emptiness or of nothingness or of aridness. Women such as Hildegard of Bingen, Marguerite Porret, Mechthild of Magdeburg, and Marjorie Kemp began to develop a vocabulary about a paradox of feeling, a feeling of being both empty and full. More precisely, as that conceptualization of feeling was developed by Meister Eckhart, who was influenced by the Beguines, Porret, and Mechthild, and in its classic form, by St. John of the Cross, the 16th century Spanish mystic, it featured a spirit said to be purged and annihilated of all particular affections, at the same time that it manifested desire, a desperate yearning for God. In other words, it insisted upon the profound experience of what many theologians called passion, that is, desire, at the same time that it reported the absence of any particular feelings. If the Thomistic emotional synthesis, comparatively speaking, was a positive joining of body and soul in affectus, for many mystics, it was an assertion of the absence and presence of emotion at the same time. The experience of God as absolute unity was a matter of profound desire, and equally the complete lack of discrete feelings. The Reformation itself offered up a mixed bag of conceptions of emotion, as well as a variety of judgments about the role of feeling in Christian devotion. Biblical humanists, such as Erasmus and Calvin, each in their own way, turned away from the Stoic doctrine of apatheia, even while they and some other writers were rehabilitating aspects of Stoicism. Erasmus opened the door to thinking differently about feeling, as experience apart from the body, and at the same time remained conventional in his belief that passions, as they traditionally had been conceptualized, remained disruptive of the exercise of reason. Among such writers, interest in the physicality of emotion diminished, and a reconception of emotion in its connection to Christ and angels began. Erasmus's analysis of the agony in Gethsemane, Christ as an emotional actor, served as a marker of that trend. The Spanish humanist Juan Luis Vives' Passions of the Soul in 1538 distilled a stunning array of previous writings impressing the case that emotions were important for the ethical direction they prompted. Emotions were motions of the soul, and as such carried ethical valence that could shape behavior by preventing a person from giving in to evil. Vives wrote that God, our admirable creator, provided all animals with affections as incentives to move souls destined to inhabit bodies, to prevent these souls from being downcast and oppressed under the burden of the body like a lazy donkey, forever languid and asleep, oblivious of their real good, negligent in doing what was required for their welfare. Emotions are spurs to move the soul this way or that way, reins to restrain it from running into the harmful. Vives accordingly reinforced a current of interpretation that had been underway in medieval mysticism, in Aquinas, and in early modern Christian humanism. A willingness to recognize feeling as a human experience that was qualifiedly useful for its contributions to ethics, while at the same time dangerous because of the potential for emotions to blow too hard, as Vives wrote, pushing a person off course in navigating to the good. Such a conceptualization resisted a hard-edged Platonism and sought ways in which to validate emotions in the language of theological ethics, theorize an interrelationship between body and soul, and posit that interrelationship as the real. Descartes subsequently did much to undo what such previous early modern theorists had achieved. Rehabilitating Plato, Descartes divided soul and body, making the former real, while asserting that engagement with the physical world through the body resulted in erroneous perceptions. Passions, which were bodily enmeshed with appetites and desires, were then inclined to shape perceptions that were false. Pressed by his corresponding partner, Princess Elizabeth of Bohemia, to define the passions in order to know them better, he proposed that passions were those perceptions, sensations, or emotions of the soul which we refer particularly to it and which are caused, maintained, and strengthened by some movement of the spirits. By spirits, he meant, following the notion of animal spirits in Galen, a mechanical, physiological process involving internal body dispositions in which blood, that is, spirits, moved through the body to prompt bodily motions. He named 6 passions as core experiences: wonder, love, hatred, desire, joy, and sadness. But he noted that even wonder, like all passions, could be excessive or directed at inappropriate objects, and therefore disruptive and damaging. For Descartes, the body cannot think, and the mind was external to the body. Passions were, again, a threat to mind. It was about this time that discourse about feeling began to develop the emphases that would result in the term emotion entering Christian theorizing. That word was migrated from France to England in the early 17th century as a descriptor of physical movement, movement of the human body as well as natural phenomena such as wind and waves. It was used for a short while in reference to strong feeling and then broadly to describe a range of modes and intensities of feeling. It was well established in the Anglophone vocabulary of philosophy and medical literature by the early 18th century, when Francis Hutcheson employed it. Hutcheson echoed aspects of Thomistic thinking in distinguishing passions and affections and aligning the latter with intellection and the moral sense. Speaking of humans' love of moral excellence, Hutcheson pointed out, as we have benevolence toward a friend when he may need our assistance, so the same emotion of soul or the same disposition toward him shall remain when he is raised to the best state we can wish. And then it exerts itself in congratulation or rejoicing in his happiness. In this manner, may our souls be affected toward the deity. But such movement was for Hutcheson a moral sentiment or a moral sense. Of the many different elaborations of such an idea, some of which were most noticeable within Scottish common sense philosophy, the ones that stand out in Christian theologizing have to do with the affections as feelings capable of moving the soul to embrace moral ideals. The affections, Jonathan Edwards famously argued in the mid-18th century, issued in fruits, that is, in sound moral behavior. But the conceptualization of emotion as a stimulus to moral action in a process, as the Scots especially explained, that involved will, cognition, and affectivity, was just one step, albeit a crucial one, on the way to a more sweeping conceptualization of emotion that was proposed by the German pastor Friedrich Schleiermacher at the turn of the century. So much has been written on Schleiermacher's notion of the feeling of absolute dependence as a specifically religious emotion that we need not dwell on it. As it was refined in the early 20th century by Rudolf Otto, that conception of emotion emphasized religious experience as emotional experience and presumed that such emotion, a complex mixture of the fascinating and the repugnant, of holy awe and fearful trembling, grounded morality, collaborating in complex ways with thinking and volition. The ascent of emotion in Christian conceptualizations of self in the last century, on the heels of Otto, and significantly advanced by new and rehabilitated styles of Christian religiosity such as Pentecostalism, can be gauged in the stunning successes of global evangelicalism, which has made for itself a most impressive empire in the Americas, Asia, and Europe, and especially in the global South. Just thinking of the global South makes me thirsty. The unbridled embrace of feeling as the goal and measure of Christian devotion among evangelicals has embedded its appeal in societies where feeling never was rendered as suspect as it was in the West, and where the cultivation of feeling and the encouragement of intense public performances of feeling long have been commonplace features of collective religious life. Roman Catholics and Orthodox Christians, the latter of which has an emotional history that diverts a bit from the narrow Western one that I have sketched, also evidence in recent times a concept of emotion that theologically legitimates its expression. Catholics, of course, have since early medieval Europe been engaged in deeply emotional collective dramas, such as Passion Week exercises and mass pilgrimage. But in 20th century developments such as charismatic Catholicism, a rough correlate to the religious practice of Pentecostals, there is clear evidence of the deep trust in emotion as a guide to spiritual development and moral rectitude. But the question remains as to whether and how Catholic and Orthodox theologians have responded to the recent emotionalism of the populace in a way that clearly marks a new effective turn in Christian systematics. Okay, there's so much more to say. Given the time constraints, I've made a hard choice to focus today on Christian conceptualizations of emotion that can be tracked in the literature of elites, almost all of whom are male and white, and the majority of whom are in fact clergy. I previously have written extensively about popular religion, or if you will, lived religion, if some are still calling it that, and the way in which new conceptualizations of emotion percolate up from the streets as people practice new affective behaviors. And I've inquired into how emotion in Christianity is gendered, such as in the businessman's revival in mid-19th century America, when a newly coalescing religious setting fostered the transformation of gendered categories of emotion in revival meetings. And I have addressed how African sensibilities have had a strong effect on the expression of feeling in American churches. But today I'm already out of time and have barely scratched the surface of the development of emotion concepts per se. But these other topics are the ones we most need to study, right? So again, I've chosen to talk about this today because in keeping with the proposal for the papers, we need some sort of historical framework to begin a discussion. But these other topics are the ones we most need to study. We have well-established, useful narratives about how emotion has been conceived in Christianity over the last 2 millennia. What matters now, most of all, is to complicate those narratives, to find ways to enrich them, challenge them, revise them, to continue to identify what has been distinctive about women's religiosity, a project well underway the last 30 or 40 years, and to investigate how it has contributed to shaping some of the conceptualizations I have described. By the same token, it is time also to commit our study of emotion in Christianity to a serious consideration of how colonial encounter and post-colonial context have affected Christian thinking about feeling. How do Christians in the global South conceive of feeling in connection to their Christian faith or piety? And as queer studies continues to offer fresh interpretations of desire and the body, how has that thinking influenced a broader discussion of the place of emotion in Christianity? How has it had an effect? Again, much left hanging, but I do want to close in stressing that even as we discuss and debate our various interpretations of the concept of emotion in monotheistic religions, we need to be looking past what we are doing here to an even broader and more ambitious project of examining how the conceptualization of emotion in Christianity always has unfolded as a historical project in the context of institutional power and control. That is, the agenda always has been about keeping white men in power. And if that meant demeaning the emotionality of women, or of people of color, or of the poor, that would and did happen. And of course, as my brief sketch of this proposes, to abase someone's emotionality as unchristian was to complain equally that their moral capabilities were inferior. Such a course then becomes a slippery slope to a particularly dangerous emotion, hatred, or as some recent scholarship prefers to call it, religious hatred. Given that, we should invest more resources in analyzing how non-Christians, such as Muslims and Jews, historically have conceptualized emotion so that we can take the next step, which is to more clearly appreciate how there has been, over centuries, a measure of give and take between Christian and Muslim writers, or to put it more simply, how there have been common themes. That project is important for understanding how Christianity has favored some concepts of emotion over others, and equally for recognizing how those concepts at times framed adversarial relations with Muslims and Jews. I think we will find that as Christians defined a self as an emotional self, Muslims and Jews did the same to some degree, And sometimes those emotional selves could appear very different and very suspect to religious strangers. Thank you.